I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Ronak Doshi is a partner in the technology practice covering digital transformation and application. He covers horizontal technology areas such as API, AI, blockchain data and analytics, and enterprise applications. Amy Fong is a partner leading Everest Group sourcing and vendor management practice. In this role, she advises enterprises on maximizing value from strategic provider relationships in global services tech categories. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Amy.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here today. We're really excited to cover this topic. As a sourcing and supplier management person for many years now, there's been a lot of technologies that come into the ecosystem. I mean, I don't want to date myself, but when I was starting out of undergrad, we were just starting to use email. So obviously a lot of change since then and a lot of transition, and everything we're doing today is new within the last couple of decades. When we look at that in terms of sourcing professionals, there's always these big questions around how do we get involved in this. Sourcing obviously has a much better seat at the table in many places than they did otherwise. Category management has evolved, but really how we handle new technologies as they come up is still a bit tricky, I think, because our plates are full with all of the existing categories. So I have my my colleague and my IT go-to guy, Ronak, here today, who's going to talk to us about some of the things that we think sourcing needs to know. And I've kind of asked him some of the tough questions, right? When do we add this to a category or make a new category? How do we show value? I think that's one of the toughest ones, because we have trouble showing value behind savings or measuring value behind savings in a lot of areas beyond just technology. So we're going to walk through these 6 questions today, and let me get started, and we'll go through the first one, which is one thing you need to know: the influence of emerging technologies on an organization's run, operate, and change mandates. And I am going to turn it to Ronak to talk through kind of the way that we view different technologies and where they are today.
Thanks, Amy, and hey everyone. So I thought we'd start with technologies and emerging technologies or exponential technologies and what they are as the first theme, and then we talk about how this impacts us. And I thought, what's the best way to kind of answer this question is, what is emerging technologies? So I thought first let's give some names to this, right? So we've seen technologies that have helped us to drive inclusion over a period of time. This is about getting more people access to information, access to services. And that's where a lot of the technologies around, the early days of 3G and social media revolution to smartphones and now to the 5G wave, we're talking about digital inclusion as being the strong theme. And then there's the next set of technologies, which was about the foundational infrastructure that allowed us to be able to kind of, create these digital environments, right? From integration technologies like APIs to cloud infrastructures to data sets and to edge and so on and so forth. So these have been foundational elements of, driving the digital enablement piece. And the third aspect of this is, as I think from a business perspective, how can I use these to kind of drive value from the data that I have, value from the applications you're building, value from the operations you're setting up, infusion of these from AI to blockchain to digital twin. So we've seen a series of those happening out here. So that's been, to start ourselves on this journey of, today's webinar. I thought we'll talk about these technologies, but if you go to the next slide, we thought let's define this, right? So that's going to be very important. We have several dominant technologies. Think of RPA, right? Think of SQL, right? Think of Java, think of APIs that we spoke about. These are dominant technologies that are solving what problems we have today with today's technology. So we have problems around reporting of our carbon emissions. We are using some of these technologies to kind of build applications. But then there are problems that we'll have in the future, right? These are problems around security, right? So think about, as we have sophisticated attacks on our network, How do we enhance our encryption networks? How do I create computing that is secured and confidential? That's where we are solving tomorrow's problems, with some of these being tomorrow's technology. And these are the emerging technologies. What we've seen over the last decade or so is, or I would say over the last 2 decades or so, is the pace at which these emerging technologies come, and from a point proof of concepts to a scaled adoption, that cycle has been shrinking over a period of time. So technology which took say 30 years to become a dominant theme is now happening in 3 years or lesser. So the rate at which these new technologies are coming gives us very limited time to be able to adapt to them, to the sourcing challenges that we have around them. So, and that's what we wanted to talk about here, is we want to talk about this continuum of dominant technologies to emerging technologies, and how these technologies have been growing and what's been the impact out there. And that's where, if Amy, if you move to the next slide, this kind of brings to the question that you asked me, which is, as I look at all businesses, and we've done some studies across Fortune 500 enterprises, one of the things we've seen is there is a question around, how do I run my business operations more efficiently? I drive resiliency of that. I make it more adaptable, flexible, sustainable, and I have like higher productivity of all the operations that I do, and I use technologies to enable that. And we are seeing infusion of AI, automation, analytics, cloud, and other technologies in the operation cycle to drive these outcomes. But at the other hand, we are also seeing, can I create new products faster? Can I create better experiences? Can I go towards new channels? Can I create new business models? So we are also seeing a lot of innovation happening in the way we want to serve our customers, the products that we offer, and then the underlying technology that we need to be able to support that. That's where the innovation cycle comes in. And if you look at, both of these are focused on driving business outcomes. These business outcomes that we studied across a set of Fortune 500 enterprises was around, we want to maximize the value that we deliver to our customers through asset monetization, which is, I have the asset, could be my data, the services, the products. How are we kind of monetizing them? The second was, how are we creating these next generation products and services to help our customers? And then the overall theme is, how are we transforming the delivery of these value, and even not just delivery of value, but accelerating the value generation. And that's where these two cycles come together, and which is where the innovation cycle, which is about exploration and feasibility of new technologies, how do they fit into my business model, how it helps me to be more competitive, drive growth, does it help me to handle disruption, right? The one example that I use out here is in the insurance industry. If we are starting to see this wave of self-driving vehicles and connected vehicles, we now are in an era where we have to change our underwriting behavior. So innovation that is happening outside of the insurance industry is a disruption that we need to manage as an insurance industry professional. So I would say those are the kind of themes that we are looking at across the innovation cycle and the operation cycle coming together. And that's where we start seeing the impact of emerging technologies on how we run the procurement functions, in terms of who are the right suppliers we work with, and what are their capabilities, and what's the engagement model, and several other questions that Amy, we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, thanks. All great examples and points. I think the example of self-driving vehicles is a particularly interesting. There's so many impacts on technologies that are fairly, that we would consider like adjacent to any of these areas, and they really impact a lot in various companies. So I want to open a poll, and I know there's a lot of options here, but we just want to understand who we have on the line today, and get a feeling for some of the strategies that you're taking as your business or as your IT organization adopts emerging technologies. Some of the examples that we just spoke about. What kind of things are you doing? And you can check as many of these as you think apply. Are you reevaluating your supplier strategy to add or remove providers or suppliers? Are you partnering with your incumbent providers to invest, redesigning commercial models? looking at, creating separate category strategies, engaging the business or engaging IT earlier, tapping into alternative locations for providers of emerging technologies, looking at new frameworks and building out decision metrics for sourcing strategy decisions, or are you enhancing your learning and development efforts for your teams and sourcing to stay ahead of the technology disruption? I'm curious to see how many of these everybody's partaking in, and how mature we are right now. And obviously, as we've pointed out already, this is kind of an ongoing effort. There's no endpoint because technology continues to evolve. All right, we'll just give it another couple of seconds before we close this.
And I'm seeing, Amy, there's as the responses come in, there's a tough competition between these, right? So again, several of these are such relevant opportunities that everybody's focusing on. So it's exciting to see how the responses are shaping up.
Yeah, definitely. So it looks like I think we're closed now, or we're still moving, but should come up in just a second. There we go. All right, so over 50% of you have engaged the business and IT earlier. That's a good sign, I would say, for sourcing. One of the challenges I've heard all along is, and a lot of times is just, well, we find out when someone's ready to buy something or when they want us to, sign the contract. We need to know upfront what's being budgeted for, what are we investigating. So that's a good sign for the function, I would say, as well as reevaluating the supplier strategy. We've seen a lot of that in the last year or two as we come out of the pandemic and evaluate access to talent, and that should be carrying over to new technologies as well, because a lot of those new providers are accessing digital talent. We'll talk in a second about the kind of roles and talent you need for some of these technologies, either internally or through your providers. Any other comments on this, Ronak?
I think the two that, I think the one that did not show up that strongly was the creating separate category strategies for these emerging technologies. And again, I think this is going to become an important question as some of these technologies become dominant technology as we go ahead with. So that was the surprising one, but I think the rest is aligned in how I see this.
Yeah, I think that's a good one to point out. I will say that I've had more companies in the last couple of months come and talk about their category strategy or their category management alignment of their team, specifically for IT categories. I'm not saying that's just for emerging technologies. I think it's for all IT as we look at, the convergence of software and services and hardware. What used to be a traditional framework of, allocating work to different category managers has evolved quite a bit. And so that's actually something that we're going to deep dive into a little bit more in our research in the next few months to talk about what the modern category structure for IT looks like. So let's jump into the next point here, the next theme that we think sourcing really needs to know, which is the impact of emerging technologies at different adoption stages, and how that impacts sourcing dynamics and sourcing strategy. So, we know that something like I started with email, that's not at all an emerging technology anymore, right? But let's say we were talking about RPA, that over the last 5 to 10 years has gone through various stages. And I'll let Ronak talk a little bit more about how we view those stages and where, let me jump back, and then I'll jump in on where sourcing can, make an impact on each stage.
Sure. And this is I think a very interesting representation of how we are seeing technologies evolving different stage gate of adoption maturity in an organization. And definitely you will need to, I would say, customize this or configure this for your business, for your environment, because some of these might be at a different stage. But what we are seeing is there are technologies which come up from the R&D and academia space and start becoming relevant in the stage one, which is where we are identifying and shortlisting them, right? So we're trying to see what's our interest areas in this. Is this even relevant? Should we even talk about this? And again, the good example of something on stage one where we are just nominating these to be considered, right? So this is the first stage around, say, quantum computing. Okay, what does it mean? Why should I be exploring this? This has implications in terms of cybersecurity, protecting of encrypted data and networks, and that's the reason why we need to start looking at it. That's the initial awareness that we need to drive in our teams and be able to understand what's happening in this. And then we move to the next stage, which is like the ideate stage. These are technologies which are now at a stage where we are not just talking about the technology, but the use case and the implication in our environment. So for example, if I'm thinking around federated learning, I'm thinking about I need to be able to use the data to train my machine learning algorithms. And can I use federated learning for that for specific use cases? This can be around, underwriting of health insurances, to creating, omni-channel experiences on the retail side. So it could be very specific business cases is where we start doing it. And then that's the incubate stage where we are seeing these technologies being experimented with, right? So we are doing proof of concepts, we are starting to invest into them. And this is the space where we now need to engage supplier much more strategically because we are asking for the right talent, the right solutions that they can bring in, and how can they collaboratively work with us to kind of invest into these POCs. So if regulations want us to explain why an AI model is taking certain decisions it is so that it doesn't have any bias in it, we need explainable AI. If we need to create these immersive experiences on the metaverse, we need to have the right platforms and the skills around it. And these skills are very hard to find. And again, we're going to talk about those in a few slides. But then how do we engage with suppliers to kind of do these POCs and work with them? And the last stage is activate stage, when this is getting at a scaled level across the organization. This is like technologies like blockchain. These are technologies like digital twins and IoT, which we are now starting to see adopt across manufacturing, automotive, life sciences, healthcare, and across the board. So we're starting to see this across industries, these being adopted, and then driving this. So as we look at technologies, they take their own sweet time as they move through these different stages, and each technology has its own, I would say, adoption curve. Something like blockchain, which was introduced in early 2009, 2010, is now in another 10 years in an activate stage. And something like explainable AI, which has been there for the last 30, 35 years as a concept, is now starting to move into the incubate activate state. So each technology definitely takes its own sweet time to get there. But what we've seen is some of these technologies do have that exponential curve behind them and go really fast. And if we, I think, move to the next slide, I think we want to talk about what it also means from a sourcing implications. And I did want to hear your views on this, right? Which is, what are the implications of each of these that you see, and what are the actions that we need to take here?
Yeah, thank you. So looking at, thinking about this from a sourcing perspective, I think it's really helpful, first of all, to understand these different stages and to know that different technologies will move through these stages. Sorry. And others might, but understanding how you behave at different stages and how you can support your business at different stages, I think, is really important. So the first level, nominate, or stage one, we tend to think of this as being more getting familiar and helping to drive awareness across the procurement organization, across the function around the new technologies and broad implications. And I love that action idea here of having at least one time a year, having a session where your team is learning from either academics or R&D or technology leaders or influencers to understand the timelines and the kind of things that are coming out. If you looked at that last slide and you thought, wow, I haven't heard of half the things on this, well, this is how you hear about them. I've certainly been with firms where clients have brought in digital strategists just to talk to the sourcing organization and say, here's what's coming down, and here's a few ideas of how it may impact companies, and this may or may not apply with your own, but think about this so that you feel comfortable and you can start to approach things in a timely manner. The next stage, ideate, is also about kind of driving awareness, but also thinking at that point about the potential business impact and the use cases. And this really involves collaboration both internally and also with your suppliers, bringing in your suppliers to help them work with the business, collaborate on, emerging technologies, use cases, potential adoption cycle. There are, for everything on that page, there are specialists out there and experts who are very deep into it and are looking for the use cases. And this is, not something that your organization is going to do on its own. So having those conversations is important. I would say even more important is making sure you're enabling the conversations between your suppliers and the right people in your organization. So I have often seen in, SRM, supplier relationship management, that as we try to drive innovation, we're doing it very operationally. The day-to-day people are talking to the day-to-day supplier, executing people, and they're talking to the, maybe the people in a factory, the people on the ground, to the operational roles. And, that's good. That's what you do to keep the business running. But if you really want to elevate, you need to get the senior R&D people from that supplier in with your R&D team or with your, digital technology strategy team, and be talking years out, talking roadmaps and that kind of thing. And so sourcing can play a big role in enabling that as we get through the ideate and the incubate stages. And when we get to incubate, this is more about supporting the business with the supplier intelligence, with proof of concepts, with experiments, and finding, building the mechanisms for governance and for measuring ROI. And this is really where I'd say the heavy activity starts. Engaging on things like hackathons or co-innovation, or a lot of the things that happen in this phase might be contrary to your traditional typical sourcing process, where you go through a long RFI, and then an RFP, and then negotiate a contract for a long term. This is a much more flexible and agile, with a little a type process for the sourcing team and working with your stakeholders. We talk here about shifting left in the adoption process, which is really about co-creating a sourcing strategy with the business and preparing for the next phase of getting to scale. And then we get to stage 4, which is activate, right? This is really where we start scaled adoption, aligning with across business functions or within functions, targeting supplier intelligence, and bringing all of your best practices from your normal sourcing and contracting process to make sure that you're monitoring these technologies on a longer basis. And this is where you might start assessing your suppliers through your normal performance management program, bringing on new providers or suppliers, so you have multiple sources of a technology, looking at industry benchmarks and contract terms and sourcing models, and really looking at the value of all of these actions in the bigger picture. Anything you would add on here, Ronak, that sourcing people can do to work well with IT and enable this?
Yeah, and I would say, Amy, out here, one of the challenges that I think you mentioned, and I wanted to emphasize on that, is in the incubate phase, you are working on this in an iterative, agile manner. And it's very hard to govern and measure these initiatives, right? Because these are emerging technologies where the talent is currently in short supply. The suppliers are in a position where they have the awareness of the technology, they've been investing into it, so they want to be working with you. And that's where I think one of the things we've realized is, as you're working in this agile mode of experimentation, POCs, the challenges, and again, there's one of the questions in the chat also around, having the right KPIs or having the right SLAs defined for performance. I would say this is where it's very critical to work collaboratively with the business and even the IT team to identify outcomes for the engagement and sign up for outcomes, instead of saying that this is something which we would want to do in a T&M based model or any other. So this is a great opportunity to rethink the commercial models in some cases, because in a lot of these cases, we don't even have a strong visibility on what metrics should we be using, because the nature of the technology and how it is evolving really fast. So we do recognize those challenges. And being creative in some of these metrics also become important. Is standard operational metrics might not be relevant, and we might have to look at alternative metrics around, say, if it's a metaverse pilot, let's do a POC with certain, beta users and see what's the experience feedback on that. And that becomes important. And this is like direct outcomes. And we're going to talk about it, but I think that is something which we need to now start having to question our standard KPI SLAs in some situations, which might not apply specifically in the ideate incubate space. But as they move to activate stage, some of our standard playbooks can be adapted much more easily.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, so with that, let's jump to the next idea or thing that we think you need to know, which is how to evolve your category strategies to support these different phases in the adoption cycle for technology. And this is a bit more of a graphical view of going through those stages. So as you were going through the technologies going through those stages, we really need to adopt both the way we look at sourcing strategies and our overall category management strategies. So during the aware phase, you're looking at, you're really focused on driving internal awareness and potential business cases. And early on technology strategy, the IT business probably doesn't know how they're going to use that technology yet. They're just throwing around ideas. So educating on that, understanding that, collaborating closely to understand what they're thinking is really important. As you move towards adapt, the firm-wide strategy is starting to be formed. And business units now might have budget and they're encouraged to adopt different technology. The sourcing organization is adapting actions and strategy. I would say one of the things that you go through at this point is aligning across different business units on suppliers, on strategy, on how you want to do this. And I'll take the example of RPA. Procurement as a function has the ability to look across the enterprise, across different business units and functions. And that's part of the advantage that we play. It's part of the value that we add. When RPA was rolling out, kind of nascent a few years ago, several years ago, there were, some companies that decided their strategy would be to bring on, one provider. We're going to take Blue Prism. We're going to do different, proof of concepts in many different places. There were others that decided we're going to take on 4 or 5 of the top providers, and we're going to do different pilots with all of them, and we're going to see what works best for us. And we'll sort of, I wouldn't say compete, but compare across those. And neither one of those is a better or worse strategy. They're just different strategies. But being aligned with that and setting up your evaluations and your protocol as your business starts to adapt and test out is a really big role that we can play. Transform is, as we move to that, it's more about kind of adopting and growing. So in that RPA example, hey, we've chosen X provider and we're going to go through and, roll this out and look for business cases across the organization. This is where you're really starting to see that scaling, and the spend is going to increase incrementally. And this is when we need to start thinking about, is this a category on its own? In the case of RPA, does it bundle with other services that we're buying? Is it bundling with SaaS? There's a lot of different ways to look at that, but you have to start evaluating it in the sense of your other, category strategy drivers. And then we get to, a couple places. Sometimes things continue to take off. Sometimes they kind of plateau, and at that point don't have as much impact in the sourcing strategy. And in others, they kind of decline, and then there's not really any need for changes. So this is a phase where you have to be fairly aware and react quickly and just stay aligned with the business, because any of these directions are really possible. Ronak, any comments on that kind of plateau versus decline versus transform? They're
and I would say
different trajectories.
And the thing around this is, there's this inflection point where you will realize, hey, this is going in the transform stage. This is something around RPA which will require its own category. We'll have to set up COEs. We'll have to work with multiple suppliers. Versus, it's something which is, as standard as, okay, it's become another stuff that we're kind of doing on an ongoing basis. It becomes part of our existing category with some bit of changes, and that it goes into a plateau stage. And some of these technologies don't make the light of the day, and they definitely decline. And we see that quite often. So I think knowing that, I think having the readiness to identify that inflection point for your organization and having a review cycle, right, at a regular frequency to be able to identify when it is, so that you are ahead of this curve. Because if it enters into the transform stage, and not all will do, right? So again, it will be like 1 out of 10 will do, but the ones that do, are we ready and prepared for it? Otherwise, we are, feeling the challenges in terms of managing the demand around that. So I think that's where I would say that frequency of review around this, and how do you do this for technologies as they're moving towards aware, adapt, and then the inflection point towards one of the three outcomes becomes very critical.
Yeah, that's a great point. That inflection point is really what's going to affect your future strategy, and whether this is a category of its own or not, as well as other factors, or these new providers. We'll get into a little bit of that in the next couple of sections. And I just want to touch on this next slide. There's a lot of text on some of these, so I do want to let everyone know that we are sending these slides. You'll get the slides, and you'll have the ability to watch the recording for this. So if it feels like we're giving out a lot of information, that's kind of by design. Think of this as a bit of a guide and a playbook for how to think about this. And you can always reach out after and have a conversation with our analysts about any of this, or replay it with your team, or whatever is the best fit for you. The next piece is really, as sourcing of professionals, look at different approaches based on various factors. These are some of their strategies and considerations. So level of adoption, category planning, transformation, ad hoc spend management if you get into decline. So as we go through those different phases that I just talked about, different tactics that make sense. So early on, you're thinking about what's the demand pattern of the organization likely to be, right? What are my stakeholders telling me about this? Making sure everybody kind of understands what some of those buying decisions are, as well as engaging suppliers through, really more flexible joint planning, joint workshops, whiteboarding, and then starting to think about when you're going to go with niche players versus incumbents, versus co-innovating with some of your more strategic partners. Later, you're adapting, and you're bringing on, you're educating your stakeholders on different benefits, creating go-to market strategies. Transforming is really about that category planning, acceleration, and that inflection point we just talked about. And then depending on where you go, if you continue to transform versus plateauing and kind of merging this in with your existing strategies in IT, or even declining, when you start to look at, do we need to is the spend going down in this? Do we need to kind of ramp down smaller providers and let this just be something that our mainstream providers are handling, or suppliers are handling? So a lot of different phases here to be thinking about, and your activities really should be evolving at different increments. Let's bring up another poll here, looking at just how you're evolving your category strategies, or how often you review them. So if you've got category strategies in IT, how often do you review? Do you update them every quarter, every 6 months, every year, 2 years, 3 years? Or do you not? Do you just kind of keep them, steady? This question probably applies to all categories, because reviewing and refreshing is a regular process, but specifically curious here about your IT and digital type categories. And we can probably close this one fairly quickly. It's a pretty quick answer. It's just one selection. Okay, so everybody's doing it, and most people, majority are doing it on an annual basis. Not even the majority, but or every quarter or every 6 months, and then a few of you 2 years, or some of you haven't. We won't tell on you, but I think every year is the cadence I've seen most often. I guess I would make the point, as the category management trainer, that category management is supposed to be an ongoing process. So you should be refreshing and adding insights and adding market intelligence on an ongoing basis every week. What are the interesting changes that we need to be capturing? But all of that said, I think a broader update every year is about what I've seen in the market as well. All right. Let's jump to, we can close the poll and then we'll go on to the next section here. And at this point, we want to talk about how to align your supplier segmentation and portfolio strategy to this evolving category landscape. And, you know, one of the bigger questions, the more common questions we get, in fact, I think I saw one in the questions already, is, you know, do I use my incumbent suppliers? When do I need to bring in new providers to do something? And the addition to that is, you know, when do we hand something over to an outsourced third party, or when do we handle it internally? So there's a lot of complicated questions around this, and I'm going to turn it over to Ranik, who's definitely more market facing and looks at these providers and the provider groupings on a daily basis.
Thanks, Amy. And I think this is an important question to ask, because as we look at the landscape of suppliers, you know, it gets, I would say, complex. It gets voluminous in some sense, and there are so many different ways to segment and categorize this, right? But what I thought was, as we are talking about emerging technologies, let's have a few terminologies that we all align into so that we can talk about this in the next slide or so. But again, I think the one thing that we want to talk about is technology providers. These are all the large and mid-sized, the software, hardware, technology providers. They provide you with these products and solutions and pre-packaged solutions that come to you for specific technologies, or a combination of these technologies in most cases. Then there is this bunch of system integrators who are bringing the right services for application development, maintenance, infrastructure, and other areas, and analytics and RP and others, who are bringing these, you know, integration capabilities, services capability, the right talent to help you adopt these emerging technologies integrated with your existing environment. And then there's a huge bunch of these innovative startup and small tech suppliers who are, you know, doing work on point solutions, right? They're addressing your problem statements at specific point areas, and then they keep scaling as they grow and as the technology grows. And the way we have seen this is, the supplier landscape is vast, and we can take one example on the next slide to actually talk about that, Amy. If you look at the next slide, this is about the Web3 and metaverse space, and I thought that could be a good example. It is one of those incubate stage, technologies which might just soon come into the the next stage of a scaled adoption. And if it does, it has the potential to even transform and kind of become one of its own categories in itself, hopefully. So there are different types of providers we're working with, right? At one end, we're working with large technology providers, the hyperscalers, who are providing the infrastructure, compute, and underlying infrastructure technology components to run these and manage these applications, which is like, these modern experiences that we're trying to build. And then on the other hand, we have these hardware and software companies, which are providing the actual devices and the hardware for us to be able to run these experiences, both at the client side, at the user side, but also at the backend server side. Then we have a combination of what I would call as these distributed ledger, blockchain technologies, who are providing the frameworks for us to operate. We are launching these innovative tokens on them. We are launching these NFTs and these other monetization models. So they're very critical from a business component perspective, right? They are the ones which are helping to monetize these experiences. So working with them is important. And then integrating with the large independent software providers, right? So these are the Oracles and Salesforce and SAP. How do you work with all of them to kind of, bring all of this together? And then there's a rich startup we spoke about, right? If you look at the Web3 space, it is one of the richest startup landscape currently, with amazing innovation that is happening out here. How can sourcing team be a step ahead and work with them to bring these innovation internally? I think that's going to be important, because that's one of the aim that we want to work around this. And then the design consulting and IT service providers, they are the ones who are orchestrating this ecosystem in a lot of cases and building the right talent so that we can have that, we can adopt this, and we can scale a lot of these initiatives. And what happens is, as we look at our segmentation piece, we have different categories for each of these areas from a sourcing perspective. But for a technology, all of these categories, we need to kind of manage and orchestrate to be able to deliver the outcomes. So even if there are folks who are doing this for software, hardware, devices, services as different categories, and each of them have their different managers, for Web3 business outcomes or metaverse business outcomes, you'll have to work across these different categories to be able to kind of deliver those. And that's where this becomes very important in terms of how do we segment the supplier landscape? How do we see this as technology which is aligned to the business outcome and the suppliers around it? So I think that's what one of my key messages was. Amy, I'll take a pause here, see if you want to add anything to this one.
No, I think this is you really hit on all of it, and there's so many different groups here to consider across the providers, the startups, the integrators, and I would think in some cases it's a combination of all, right? Trying different groups of providers to see what really pans out.
Yeah.
So Wernick, I know you wanted to do this poll too.
Sure. Yeah, and again, this is, I think, one of my favorite ones because I keep getting these questions, right? So we've been doing a lot of work in these emerging technologies. And one of the questions I keep getting is, how much of convictions can we drive on our existing suppliers to bring these emerging technologies into our environment? Should we have to look outside? Should we have to kind of work with others? And there's always this doubt in everyone's mind, and that's why I thought, okay, let's see what the reaction of the of our audience today is, right? How do they see their suppliers keep the confidence on their suppliers and their capabilities to bring in the right skills and talent needed for these emerging technologies? And I know this is a fairly quick one, so we'll close this, but we'll just close it in a second. Yeah. Okay, so again, if you look at it, the results are out here. So, almost 64%, right? Again, are talking about not having the full confidence, right? So the high confidence is very low. I think that's one thing that we are seeing. So this is equally insightful for the suppliers as much as it is for the the sourcing team, right? As they're thinking about who they work with. But this creates implications for us. One is, we need to constantly evaluate the overall landscape beyond our existing suppliers to see if we are missing out. So I think that's going to be one. And then how do we work with these suppliers across different categories? Because a lot of these then start overlapping in their coverage and as their and the outcomes that they're providing. So I think that becomes critical. And we're getting one of the questions also in the chat around how do we welcome some of these new suppliers into our ecosystem, and that's where creating these specific programs around technologies which we believe are going to be potentially reaching that breakout point and then inflection point and going to the transform stage. Those are the areas we absolutely need to work with the ecosystem much ahead of time, create programs to welcome them to your innovation days, ask them to present at your events, speak to the business team, technology teams at a regular interval. So having a way to work towards getting these startups involved is going to be important. Plus, there are several avenues where these startup and innovative technology companies are present. So I think attending some of these forums and spotting them and working with them ahead of the curve, it might not be a bad idea as we see about it.
Yeah, that's great. This is really helpful. And as we close that poll, I'm going to jump into one more slide, just thinking about kind of broader supplier segmentation and portfolio, since that's a topic that we talk about a lot. And I think some of the general principles really kind of tie in with some of the things that Wernick just said, specific to these groups of suppliers. So I will clarify, when I talk about supplier segmentation, I'm tending to think about that broad enterprise level SRM concept of looking across all of our suppliers across different categories and business units and stakeholders and saying, look, we're using, this big SI/consulting firm in every part of the business, but for all these different activities, versus others that might be, and they're a strategic provider, and here's another one that, we're not, and they also are strategic for different reasons. Whereas portfolio, I tend to think of your portfolio strategy as at a much more, lower level or tactical level within specific categories. So often when we're talking about BPO providers or IT apps for outsourcing, we're looking at, do I have the 2 or 3 providers that I want to compete in this area and that bring me the right level of support. And some of the factors that we encourage our clients to look at are, the emerging capabilities of those suppliers, which is specifically appropriate here when we're talking about new technologies, market intelligence across those different provider or portfolio strategies and supply-based ecosystems, risk thresholds. Obviously, some providers or suppliers bring in higher risk than others, but also balancing across suppliers to mitigate your risks and to, make sure that you've got, another concept we use often is control ratios, that you get the right mix to balance the risk and mitigate as much as possible. The talent mix, and we're going to talk about skill sets for digital in just a second. Optimizing the scope, again, that often has to do with the control ratios, and other times it's putting in place alignment with your business units across different demand needs, and then cost structures. So understanding the TCO across these different providers, I think when we look at some of the different suppliers that we just talked about, the supplier types, the total cost of ownership model is going to be different across different types of suppliers, and the scope is going to be different. So really getting to an evolved model where you can evaluate across all of those. I want to jump into the last couple of points here because I think they're important, but we can probably cover them a little more quickly. The next one is how to stay ahead of business and IT demand by identifying and sourcing roles and skills of the future. And this gets to that talent piece. We have been talking quite a bit about talent over the last the last year or so in the Great Resignation. So Renik, for a second, I know we could talk for hours about talent availability and skills and premiums and things like that, and happy to do that with anyone, but let's touch on what you see here.
Sure. And I would say it's a 3-phase journey that we would definitely recommend everyone to understand is, as we saw the technology maturity continuum, doing a regular review of the technology is important, as Amy mentioned, but also looking at this from an IT skills and talent perspective. So I think working with the IT and business to understand what are the future competencies that we need to build as we adopt these emerging technologies, and the ability to use data and some bit of analytics to be able to predict or forecast what is the kind of demand that we expect. I think that's going to be step 1. And then the step 2 is about defining this requirement more clearly. And this will happen iteratively over a period of time, but this is going to be very critical because once we get this right, we are able to be ahead of the demand curve and be able to source for emerging technology much better, which is the phase 3, because this is the space then you can work with suppliers better. You can understand how are they kind of building this talent pool, what are the initiatives that they're taking, and where would you want to be collaborating and working with them. So I would say this 3-phase approach, from doing the gap assessment, defining the requirements on an iterative basis on an ongoing fashion, and then working towards creating the sourcing strategy for these emerging technologies as they move through their adoption cycle, becomes very critical out here. And if you move to the next slide, I think we thought we'll give you a few examples of these, right? So if I look at some of the technologies we're talking about today, right, blockchain or metaverse or confidential computing and others, there are new roles that are getting created because of the adoption of these technologies. These roles did not exist in our existing service catalog or IT skills taxonomy. So then it becomes important to have that, and then have the right skills to be able to then, find these skills, and then, be able to kind of, help our business and IT as they adopt these technologies. So I would say that becomes very important. That's where the gap assessment and requirement definition, doing it right, doing it on a regular frequency on iterative basis, and then creating and updating sourcing strategy becomes very critical as we think of these emerging technologies. Amy, anything that you would want to add up here?
Yeah, I think this is a great, helpful list. I think it's important to understand as sourcing people that this list of key skills, and the skills in terms of where you should be, the pricing, where you should pay a premium and where you shouldn't, evolves so quickly. It's something I learned when I came into, Everest Group and working deep with these categories, that, 1 quarter certain languages might be demanding a premium and there's a shortage of programmers. And then the next, it's completely shifted because the market caught up. So staying on top of this is really important. If you're in our pricing as a service program. That's data that you have access to, and our advisors or an analyst can help you with that. But I think, you know, that's important to note if you're not familiar with a lot of these categories, that it's really different than many of the others across the business, across indirect. I want to jump into the last point here, and we're coming up on the end of the time, but the last one is, how do you measure value from emerging technology and services categories? So I know that we've all been trying to show that we do more than just save money. And when we get to emerging technologies, these are very rarely just a cost savings story, right? I think there was some, you know, early in the RPA journey where we're just maybe your automation, you know, displacing labor for process costs, and there's some cost savings there. But most of what we've talked about today is really things that are going to drive the business, drive revenue from your customers, add a stakeholder experience, whatever, right? There's a lot of different options here. So I think we need to be looking at all the other types of value and figuring out how to measure it and which applies where. That's a pretty complex conversation, and it's specific to each organization. The advice I give to category managers is to go ask your stakeholder, or really you should already know, what is your stakeholder's top 3 or 4 or 5 priorities for this spend. You know, if they're bringing in a new specialist to do X, why? What are their priorities? That's the value you should be measuring. I mean, if they say savings, that's great, but most of the time savings is like 6 or 7 and may not even be on the list. So we wanted to give just a few examples here. For metaverse, you know, you could be looking at supplier innovation in terms of the number of projects that your suppliers are collaborating on. There's a lot of different ways to measure innovation, and it's often a maturing metric that phases in over time. But it's an important one because this has a lot to do with innovation. Customer experience is another one where, you know, measuring customer satisfaction or retention or the level of engagement can really give you better insights. For blockchain, often it's risk, contract compliance, and process improvement, looking at the transaction volume. In that case, it may be cost, but not, you know, spend cost savings, but process cost savings in another part of the business. And cost savings in terms of cost reduction as well, because there's some things that are, you know, kind of more evolved there and can be, you know, you can look at your costs quarter to quarter, year to year. Cloud computing, often, you know, supply assurance is important, the compliance rate, supplier defect rate. I would say another one that's been coming up lately in some of our, you know, conversation with service providers is matching, is kind of demand management or spec management, matching the right quantity of cloud space to you know, what the business actually needs. And there seems to be a lot of gaps from what I'm hearing from providers right now. So that's another area where collaboration and measuring how you get that right can have a big impact. So I want to jump here. We always try to kind of give something away to sourcing teams as we're doing these. And because this is a really evolving category, not meaning to be punny there, with emerging technologies, we wanted to offer the opportunity to review your category strategies. If you have a draft category strategy, if you have a developed, evolved category strategy that's kind of been formalized, just a conversation with our analysts to review it. There's a couple of examples of categories here, like cloud and machine learning and digital twins. If you click on this link, it'll bring you to a form. We're fairly open on what that category is. And it can be a draft or formal. Like I said, you don't have to have something, you know, that's completely finalized. But what we can do is have a conversation for half an hour just to talk through, you know, the approach you're taking, deep dives into market intelligence. Are there growth segments that you've included or not included? How could you be prioritizing your projects, other peer insights? So happy to do this for people. Obviously, this is meant to be for buy-side sourcing teams or category managers or others who are buying these kind of technologies. If you're happen to be joining as a provider, you know, there's a lot of other ways we can help you, but this one doesn't make a lot of sense. So please click that link, and you can do that now, or you can fill it out after this webinar. And we'd love to work with you and deep dive and get into the nitty-gritty of this a little bit more. With that, I want to end on some final advice for sourcing teams. And this just summarizes a lot of the points we talked about earlier, but, you know, make sure you're putting in an external feedback loop. having suppliers, strategic suppliers especially, share regular updates on where they're going with various technologies, what their capabilities are, what they see as the use cases. Engage with IT teams and analysts early in the adoption cycle. So make sure you're getting third-party expertise brought in and make sure that you're working with IT. Collaborate across the organization on metrics. So when you're deciding how to measure success with suppliers and success with the program, those should be closely aligned, but also reasonable to accommodate what your internal role is. It's not all on the suppliers with this. So make sure you're jointly developing those performance programs. Look for opportunities for co-creation across the ecosystem. So that could be with your SIs, it could be with your providers of technology, it could be with other startups. Great reference slide that Ronak went through a couple minutes ago. Drive cohesion across internal and external labor strategy. So I know that often sourcing thinks we manage spend, but if you're buying services, you manage talent as well. You manage external talent. Think about how that creates synergies or leverages internal talent or crosses, because it's all one big picture, whether it's contingent, whether it's outsourced, or whether it's internal. And then finally, make sure you're using RFIs to gather information on new technologies capabilities, both talent access as well as solutions from suppliers. So RFIs can be your friend here. It's an easier way to access and then decide whether you need to go through a regular sourcing process with an RFP or not. With that, we have just a couple minutes left. I know we have a number of questions come in before and during. We may try to respond to some of those in email. I know we've been trying to hit on those as we spoke. Ronak, any closing thoughts or things that you want to throw in before we wrap up here?
No, I would say, Amy, one of the questions is around the governance and governance capabilities, and I thought I'll take that one and also weave my closing remarks around that. I would say the evolving nature of these emerging technologies, like they become living entities in some ways. They're kind of growing through their own journey. So what happens is the way you govern them, that governance journey also, and the capabilities around that also has to evolve as these technologies evolve. But what we've seen is there are certain standard principles that work really well, which is having standard ROI based models before driving investment. So being aware of those and being influencing those ahead of the adoption curve. The second being around tighter governance around what needs to be done in terms of adoption cycles and taking interim review calls around which programs need to be folded down, which program need to be scaled up. I think having those are going to be very important. So it's a feedback loop that needs to come very strongly. And the third that I've seen is encouraging suppliers to do a lot of self-reporting in some of these cases, because they are even eager to do that. They would love to do that and they would want to show their outcomes, and being very open to kind of getting those from them. I would say that definitely is something which I see to be very relevant, because the standard models of governance will exist, but I think if you add these three to that pool, it does help to kind of drive that cohesion as we talked about out here. And this is also a great feedback loop, right? So which we were kind of talking about here.
Yeah, that's all great points. So I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to thank everybody for attending today. Again, hit that link if you'd like to have a conversation about your specific enterprise, strategy. That is confidential and there's no charge for that. It's just something we want to do to make sure that, we're kind of guiding the industry on this. And again, you'll get the slides. You will have access to a recording of this, and really appreciate everyone attending. I appreciate Ronak taking the time to talk to sourcing people. Always love it when we get some collaboration across functions, and he's a good go-to guy for everything IT, new technologies, services, banking, insurance, lots of industry knowledge as well. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks, Amy.